We now move to Professor Manuel Eisner from basic Criminology. You already met him. Still the same person. Manuel, the floor is yours.
Good. So, what I will be talking about today is changing a little bit of the focus. Although I've done some randomized control trials, I'm not going to talk about external validity of randomized control trials, but I will talk about my other research passion, namely big picture, long-term systemic changes, and I will focus on the example of crime declines. Now, nobody has talked so far about the gold standard, and so I thought I should give you a brief history of the gold standard so that we know what we're talking about. This is not going to be a long history, it's only going to be 3 dates. The gold standard was first introduced into experimental research in 1982 when the double-blind placebo-controlled RCT was first described as the gold standard in medical research. So relatively late, surprisingly late. So we already heard that last year Dan Neugen and Rob Sampson introduced the real gold standard. Now, Cambridge, as some of you may not be surprised to hear, has been ahead of time. Because in 1931 already, John Maynard Keynes announced the end of the gold standard. Now, it's important to listen to this quote. There are few Englishmen who do not rejoice at the breaking of our gold fetters. We feel that we have at least a free hand to do what is sensible. The romantic phase is over, and we can begin to discuss realistically what policy is for the best. So this leads me to the core argument, because I think Rob's and Dan's argument is very similar to John Maynard Keynes' argument when the gold standard was abandoned. So what they're arguing, and this is a summary, a non-technical summary of what they were saying, randomized social experiments are unable to measure long-term system or society-wide impacts of the treatments that are being tested. Those long-term system-wide impacts are important to both policy and science. How can research address squarely what experiments cannot feasibly do? For example, analyze jurisdiction-wide and longer-term impacts. We need to broaden the scope of inquiry to measure long-term equilibrium outcomes, and the experimental literature is not linked to long-term system-wide analysis, and so on. So we've heard this argument, and I think there is some similarity between what Rob and Dan were arguing. So free our thinking in terms of causal impacts from just accepting randomized control trials and accepting that there are different ways of thinking about causal mechanisms and counterfactuals and processes that matter to policymaking. Now, I think this is a particularly timely topic because, as many of you will know, in 2015, the United Nations introduced the so-called Sustainable Development Goals, which comprise 17 different goals, and for the first time ever, criminology is included. It's not been very receptive, but it has been included as, one of the major goals include reducing crime, reducing violence, and that's included in Goal 16 and Goal 5 and some other goals. But we have a big problem here. When it comes to thinking about reducing violence, and I will focus on reducing violence, yes, we do have increasingly randomized control trials, and we increasingly know what kind of programs work in RCTs. We are also beginning to learn how to scale them up and move them outside clinical trials and deliver them at larger scale and still maintain fidelity and implementation quality. And we are beginning to have relevant experiments in different countries. So we're moving outside just US. It used to be the case 10 years ago that 95% of all RCTs had been conducted in the United States or in the UK, but increasingly we see these experiments happen in other countries. But there is a number of important questions here. The Sustainable Development Goals by the United Nations say we would like to achieve population-wide sustainable declines in violence. So this is a completely different type of question, because we know close to nothing about how to achieve this population level change. And it's not really clear whether, if a policymaker asks, where should I put my money, whether we should recommend that policymakers should invest into randomized controlled trial supported policies. Maybe there are policies that are just as important, or maybe even more important, that have just not been tested by randomized controlled trials. And finally, we know very little about the kind of system changes that support these macro level declines in violence. So I think we need to broaden the horizon. And one of the ways to think about this is to say, well, can we learn something that's relevant for policymaking if we look at population-wide violence declines that have happened across societies over time, and what drove these reductions? Examples of successful violence reductions exist in all parts of the world. They exist in China, they exist in Singapore, they exist in Japan, they exist in some parts of Latin America effectively, they exist in some parts of Europe. So they usually affect, these crime declines usually affect different manifestations of violence in a similar way. They're usually not subtype specific. They're broad and affect a broad pattern of behaviors. And I think it's really important to understand why these declines happen if you want to inform policymaking that's relevant to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, because that's the kind of questions that they have. It's important to bear in mind here that when we look at historical crime declines, individual programs rarely played an important role. It was bundles of different things that seem to have been done differently. It's also important to bear in mind that neither the crime decline in Palermo, for instance, which experienced a decline by about 90%, nor the crime decline in Singapore was driven by randomized controlled trials. The evidence, if there was some evidence, it came from other types of sources. And it's not really quite clear how policymakers, if policymakers played a role, how policymakers made the right kind of decisions. Was this just trial and error? How did they arrive at the decisions that eventually was effective? So I do believe that there were policy effects, but I think that they're usually systemic and multifaceted if they happen. So there are a number of challenges when we try to look at these macro-level processes. Finding good macro-level counterfactuals is difficult. System-wide violence declines are generally overdetermined, so you have many possible variables that you can use to explain this decline. It's very difficult to make a decision which one is actually causally relevant or not. And so one of the possible ways to contribute to this debate is to use what is called comparative historical analytic approaches. That's a whole bundle of different approaches. Traditional comparative historical analysis, comparable case approaches in political sciences. There is now this tradition of qualitative comparative analysis or synthetic case control approaches. And I won't talk about the details of these techniques today. But I want to talk about one example that I'm particularly fond of, and I thought you might find this interesting as well. And it's going to be published in about a month's time in the Unodc Global Homicide Report. When I talk about homicide rates, I often start with this slide, which just lists homicide rates of 198 countries on the vertical axis, going from very low, about 0.3 per 100,000, to very high, about 100 per 100,000. So that you get an idea of where different countries stand on this vertical axis, this homicide scale. Switzerland is relatively far down. The UK slightly higher. The world has a homicide rate of about 6.5. The United States slightly below it, then Mexico, and then Honduras. So this just gives you an idea about this, what the scale is all about. And now I want to look at two extreme cases, namely Singapore, which is at the very bottom of this scale, and Jamaica, which is very close to the top of this scale. So they are kind of far apart. The difference is about 1 to 500 in homicide rates. It's a big difference. That's a big effect. And now one of the questions that a historian wants to ask is, where do these differences come from? And I can show this to you because I've collected over the last year historical homicide rates between these two countries. So this is what's happened historically in these two places. So for long periods of time, Jamaica and Singapore had almost the same homicide rate. Actually, even short-term fluctuations seem to have gone in a similar direction. But you will see that sometime around 1960, they start developing in very different directions. And the question is, why? Now, Jamaica and Singapore are an interesting example because in 1960, in terms of counterfactuals, they are fantastic. They are really quite extraordinary. I'm looking at a number of indicators in 1960, GDP per capita, average years of education, literacy rate, and so on and so forth. And here are the figures. It's astonishing that in 1960, Jamaica had a slightly higher GDP per capita, education was slightly higher, but on just almost everything we can measure, the two countries were very, very similar. So the question then arises, what was it around 1960 that led them to develop in very different directions? And I don't have a final answer, but I think what we have here is a good match at baseline. We have a large long-term treatment effect at the population level, but we have an unknown treatment. That's very typical in historical research. So you can match them, you can see the differences, but you don't know what is in the black box, what is the treatment. And so how can hypotheses about causally relevant treatments be examined? And I want to come up with 3 suggestions for discussion. The first idea is give Nagin and Sampson what they want. And so methodologically speaking. And here is the quote. So the counterfactual comparison that they desire is between a world, and I'm coming back to the housing vouchers, in which housing vouchers are made available to all poor residents jurisdiction-wide for a sustained period of time, and a world in which current housing policy continues to aid the poor as is. Now, one of the interesting things here is that when we compare Singapore and Jamaica, we are comparing to very, very different housing policies. And in fact, I would argue that the housing policy in Singapore is probably as close as you can possibly get to a quasi-experiment of a population-wide housing policy that is pretty close to moving to opportunities. So here is how they worked. Both cities in 1960 had large slums. They were both known for having high problem areas. But they went down into 2 very different areas. Different trajectory. In Singapore, the Singapore Housing and Development Board, under Lee Kuan Yew, developed a housing allocation policy that was transparent, non-discriminatory, equitable, and importantly, there was a conscious effort to promote declustering and desegregation, because each housing block had a certain quota of people coming from certain backgrounds, and you were just giving a house in this block to maintain an equitable distribution of people with certain social characteristics. Kingston also tried to develop a policy that addressed the housing crisis, but it developed into a very clientelistic housing policy, where dons, local violent entrepreneurs, essentially gave people housing if they voted for the respective party in that given year. And so what you ended up having is decreasing segregation, equal access to quality public goods, for example, schools, and territorial control by professional police, while in Jamaica you end up having persistent segregation, high inequality in access to quality schools, and territorial control by private protection specialists. Just one point here, Rob, because you mentioned social inequality. In terms of overall income inequality, Singapore and Jamaica don't differ at all. It's not an issue of overall income inequality. The argument here is that spatial segregation and spatially clustered inequality is so different and developed in such different directions. Suggestion 2, construct counterfactuals that can eliminate some explanations. When people hear about Singapore, the first thing that comes to mind for most people is Disneyland with the death penalty, which was a very interesting and very good essay written by William Gibson in 1993. Singapore, in fact, has a huge death penalty rate. Last year, it had 13 executions per capita. That's about 50 times the rate in the United States. And between 1994 and 1998, Singapore had the highest execution rate of any country in the world. Now, is there a counterfactual to examine whether that execution rate had a deterrent effect? And there is an interesting non-experimental or quasi-experimental counterfactual, and that's Hong Kong. Because, why? Because Hong Kong has a similar economic history, a similar housing policy, similar social and cultural structure, but it abolished capital punishment. Let's just briefly look at this. Here is the trend, the homicide trend in Singapore. Here is the homicide trend in Hong Kong until 1963. And in 1963, Hong Kong suspends the death penalty, and in 1992, Hong Kong abolishes the death penalty. So what happens to the homicide rate in Hong Kong? This is what happens. There is no difference whatsoever. And that is interesting. That is an important message to policymakers, to be able to say, well, this is a good match. This is a good counterfactual, a convincing counterfactual, and it shows that these two places developed in very similar ways. Now, the last thing that I want to suggest is, and I'm coming back to the paper by Dan and Rob, is it's not a criticism, but I think one of the interesting things is that they talk a lot about system. I actually found the word, I haven't counted, about 25 times. We begin by staking out the position that policies should take a system-wide perspective. Another approach to analyzing system-wide effects is developing formal models, and so on. But they never define what they mean by a system. And that's an interesting problem. If we want to think about system-wide processes, we need to have a notion of what we mean by the system that's actually relevant to analyze the causal mechanisms. That could be neighborhoods, cities, countries, and continents. And now I want to show you one graph that slightly, slightly challenges my own argument, but I think it's just so interesting to show this as another counterfactual. So first of all, I want to come back to Jamaica and show you Jamaica in conjunction with countries that are close by to Jamaica, namely Puerto Rico and Trinidad and Tobago. And one of the things that you should be able to see here, that yes, there are differences between the countries, but they're all moving along a very similar trajectory. Now, if you look at here, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Japan, they're also quite similar, and they're also moving along a declining trajectory. They're not the same countries, they have widely different policies, and it's a little bit of an interesting, it's an interesting question whether this would be an argument to say that the counterfactuals should not be neighborhoods, not cities, not countries, but maybe the counterfactuals are entire world regions. And I'm not sure whether that's the case. I'm not arguing that this is necessarily how we should think about it, but I just want to raise this as a difficult problem. So to conclude, can careful macro-level historical counterfactual analysis make a contribution to identifying causal mechanisms that matter for policies related to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? I think there are two. I just want to finish here with two answers. One is something that I take from Jack Shonkoff, this idea of from neurons to neighborhoods, just coming back to this idea that we need different methodologies to answer causal questions at different levels of reality. And there are some levels of reality where it comes to neurocognitive processes where you need clinical trials. They're trials, but they're not the kind of prevention trials that we think about here. We need clinical trials. We may be needing intervention trials, to understand some types of interventions, but we also need macro-level thinking. So we need to think about different levels at the same time and combine these perspectives if we want to try to develop arguments that are relevant for policymaking. And that brings me back to John Maynard Keynes, namely this idea of a floating systems that harvests the insight from different methodologies that then may lead to a better insight than this fiction of a gold standard that is just the one methodology against which everything should be measured. Thank you.